Good morning, everyone. Welcome to those of you joining us online, and welcome to all of you that just came in the room. My name is Lisa Grizzi, and I'm a technology reporter at Politico. We have been talking for the last 26 hours or so about the fact that Europe needs or should build tech sovereignty, and it should build resilient supply chains around digital technology, and the many, many plans to achieve that. But some speakers have also challenged the idea that we need to do everything, everywhere, all at once. So with our wonderful panel, I would say let's zero in on some of the critical technologies that will save our future and how to pick our battles. A brief reminder to ask your questions through Slido and talk about the summit on social media using the hashtag #PoliticoAITech. And without further ado, let me welcome Xavier Vasquez, who is the Vice President and CTO of IBM Technology, France, and Director of Research and Development. Agathe Desmarais, a Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and MEP Brando Benifei, who is the Chair of the Delegation for the Relations with the United States, and also Rapporteur for the AI Act. So Brando, I would start with you, and I would like to ask you, how should we think about prioritizing technologies? What is the right balance between what we can do and what we should do?
Well, first of all, thank you for this opportunity. I think that we have to distinguish between aspects of tech sovereignty where we need to be autonomous and where we can rely on, we can say, safe supply chains, and we can have broader agreements. So I personally support the approach of the Eurostack, which is the idea of having a set of different sovereign layers of technology, which means working on having more of a sovereign cloud infrastructure, computing capacity in Europe, and also working on European platforms. I would say that computing capacity seems to me extremely important for our development of an AI ecosystem in Europe. This is what I get a lot from a lot of companies. And I think it's also a matter of our digital sovereignty. I have to say that on the supply of critical raw materials that are linked to technology, I think that we cannot just rely on ourselves. We must be realistic, that we need to build safe supply chains, and we need to find ways. Probably this is part also what we will discuss in the next weeks with the US. I will also be back for a trade trip in 2 weeks in US. And I'm convinced that on this issue of the supply chains, we can have some further agreement. At the same time, I think we should not be shy in saying that we do not have a problem with the idea of exerting a so-called Brussels effect, in the sense that I got a lot of criticism from the counterparts in US about our impact of our legislation in changing the way things function also in US. Various examples, for example, recently more on the issue of so-called free speech. And I think that it's something that deals with our sovereignty to not accept that we just change our legislation because there is a contested Brussels effect. I mean, there is always an option. You can choose in which markets you operate. But if in a market you are getting more revenue than in others and you do not want to leave that, you need to follow those rules, and those rules need to be applicable. This is linked, in my view, to the idea of tech sovereignty, because it's not our problem if the way technology works in the rest of the world due to our rules is changing. is making someone unhappy. I'm sorry, but this cannot limit us in choosing what kind of rules to make this technology compatible with our democratic values we decide to have. This is also part, in my view, of the idea of sovereignty, and on this, I'm sure we cannot delegate to others.
I guess, what do you think? Given all of that, what technologies should we pick to lead on?
Well, essentially, I think that I really agree with the framing that you started with. You know, the EU will need to pick its battles because it is highly unlikely that we'll manage to be leaders in everything. And so from that perspective, I think that it's very useful to take a step back and see what others are doing, especially in the field of financing for key technologies. And I think that it's really striking to see that, for instance, in the US, more than 85% of R&D expenses in the private sector go to frontier technologies, biotech, quantum, AI, semiconductors, when in Europe, most of private R&D expenses go to mid-tech sectors, like the automotive sector. So I think that this is really a striking thing to look at, because of course investments will condition future prospects. And to me, what this means is that there is probably something to do in the field of financing for Europeans. Actually, there's, you know, this view that financing from the public sector, there isn't enough in the EU, but when we take a look at the data, EU public financing as a share of GDP is actually pretty much comparable to that in the US at roughly 0.7% of GDP. So that's actually the same metric as the US. The problem is for private financing, much less private financing in Europe, half less for existing companies, and even worse for tech startups, the ones really in quantum, in AI, in key technologies that will really power the future. I think it's really striking to see, for instance, that European companies have been receiving 9 times less venture capital funding for key sectors over the past decade than their US peers. And what this means is that European companies need to go to the US to attract funding. So probably there is something to do here. The question, to go back to your question about the key sectors, I would say frontier sectors, but there's actually a trick and something to keep in mind here. We all talk about AI, quantum computing, semiconductors, biotech. These are the frontier sectors today. The question is, what will the frontier sectors be tomorrow? And how do we identify them today? We can't really do that without a crystal ball. But these are really the sectors that we will need to identify. And in these sectors, the EU will probably need to go big. Because, you know, I was mentioning public financing isn't that low in the EU. The problem is that it's highly fragmented. It's fragmented, 93% of it comes at the EU member state level, which essentially means that it's very difficult for a massive European unicorn to emerge because of this fragmentation. So there's probably something to do here.
Okay, so I'm hearing Brando, computing, and Eurostack, which actually includes quite a lot of different technologies, frontier technologies. So Xavier, please pitch this quantum. I know you're a scientist yourself and you work on this quite a lot, but my question is, when will it be ready to really be deployed and really make a difference?
Last week, we had our big conference in IBM, which is called IBM Think. And there was a talk by Jay Gambetta, who is our leader in quantum computing. And what he was saying is that in 2026, so next year, we'll have our first quantum advantage. So it's not so far from today. And the idea is that it's not we will have a quantum advantage and everything will happen. It's a continuum. We will have different applications that will come step by step. And what we see is that there are few applications that will come sooner than the others. First one clearly is around chemicals, so discovering new materials, drug design, everything about molecule modeling, etc. Because quantum computing is really designed to do this kind of computation. Even if you provide more and more innovation, more and more compute on the classical side, you will not be able to complexify and model all these molecules. So quantum computing is really designed to do that. So this is one, let's say, the first that will come, and application will be very critical. And I think we're talking about technologies, but I think the application side is very important, and I think we should enable companies and startups and so on to build this use case, because people are building their IP right now. Then the second one is around optimization. We think it will come a little bit later. So what I call optimization is, let's say you have 500 boats, you are transporting liquid natural gas, and you have to get the gas and deliver the gas, and you have a lot of hypotheses and trajectories to calculate. So it will also bring some advantages using quantum. And the last one, that maybe will come also a little bit later, is AI and quantum. So the merge of the two technologies. You know that today when we train our models, it relies most of them on GPUs. Also, you know that when you train big models, it consumes a lot of energy, and clearly we need to find alternatives. Quantum can be one of them. There is not the only one, but can be one of them. But clearly, we need to find an alternative to this model. So just basically, we have more than 80 quantum systems deployed across the world, including in Europe, for example, our data center in Germany, but we have also a project in Spain and Romania. And today, it's almost 300 partners we are working on. So they are really working on developing the use cases and the applications on so on. And we have a big community, because we were always promoting, such as AI open source. So we developed a framework to use quantum, which is agnostic, by the way. So for example, we partner with Pascal. It's a French startup on quantum. And of course, you can use, for example, quantum Pascal system through our open source framework. So it's also a way to say that, in fact, quantum is not about only one company. It's a truly large ecosystem of public research, startup, companies, and we see quantum as a computer, but in fact, when you looked inside, is a chip, it's cables, it's cryogenic, it's microelectronics. So it's a whole industry and research that is behind that. And when we look at the future, for example, we clearly see that a quantum computer maybe will have chips coming from one company, and then the cryogenic coming from the other companies, and so on. So it's a whole ecosystem, but I will say that it's not too far, because what we call the fault-tolerant quantum computing, so which means kind of perfect quantum computer, will come in 2029.
2029, okay, I'll put that on my calendar. And I will call you if it's not there.
Yeah, you can.
I think it's really interesting also that you mentioned the partnership with Pascal, who is, to my knowledge, a fairly leading company on quantum globally. But when it comes to these partnerships, let's say between a big tech company and a smaller European company, how should we think about that, and where do we draw the line between buy European and encouraging our own company, but then not giving that up for a very large American conglomerate? I'll give this to Agath.
Okay, Agath, please.
Well, I would say that's a very tricky question, essentially, because I think that we've all been talking about tech sovereignty, but as we were prepping for this panel, we were wondering what this really means and if it's even possible, because I think that what is striking listening to Xavier is that it is unlikely that one single company can do everything, and so it's really a question also of partnerships. But I think that the background to your question is also the re-election of Donald Trump to the White House, because there are big questions at the moment. I would say the US and China are the two major tech superpowers, the two really unrivaled. Europe is behind, whether we like it or not. And so the question for Europeans, is how to continue to matter on the global economic and tech landscape. And I think that until a few months ago, it was natural for us to partner with the United States. But at the moment, there are big questions, of course, because of the political background. And so from that perspective, how can Europeans really forge a path ahead? So I don't think there is a good answer to this question. It's about identifying the key sectors. You know, we were talking about this, the frontier sectors today, but the frontier sectors tomorrow. It's also about the financing. Are we really going to be able to do that? That's a key question. The workforce also, trained workforce, key question mark in the EU. So I think that this question of partnerships is going to be key. I would actually have one thought about this one. You know, we tend to think a lot about the US and China as the tech superpowers, but when we take a look at the geopolitical groupings within the G7, we would also have natural partners with Japan, for instance. And I think that it's probably key at the political level to have some thinking around this. At the moment, it's tricky to do partnerships with the US. The US-EU Trade and Technology Council is essentially dead, and I don't think there are plans to resurrect it. But I think that we have other natural partners. That could be a chance, you know, seizing the opportunity that Trump brings to Europeans to do things differently, perhaps.
Yes, and we saw the Executive Vice President for Tech Sovereignty going to Japan this week, and she's flying straight to San Francisco, I believe. So, Brando, you will be going to the US soon. What will be your game plan in terms of, you mentioned critical raw materials in particular, but who do you expect to meet, and what do you expect the outcome of these talks to be?
Well, I have to say that at this moment, and this is linked to the topic we are discussing, I see two different tendencies in the discussions with the US. That is rather a push from some parts of the administration to actually focus on keeping high tariffs to even after negotiations to rebalance, in their view, our trade, but also looking at one issue that is very important for them, that is the VAT imbalance, because the US has no VAT as we conceive that in Europe. They have a different way of doing things, and this is creating, with the sales tax, etc., and this is creating an imbalance that is pushing for having higher tariffs staying for the future, which is a big issue, especially for the more export-oriented countries. But also the other strain of thought is working on insisting on us changing our legislation and finding agreements on supply chains also related to tech sovereignty, looking especially at China. So how we combine these different pushes in a reasonable deal that can also benefit Europe is our effort. And I have to say I fully support the approach of the European Commission being quite firm in making it clear that we have some red lines and some boundaries that we cannot cross. I think that we need to preserve our ambition to have tech sovereignty while looking at these agreements that we have to work on. If I may just comment on one thing I heard about the Japan cooperation, I think it's absolutely true, it's important, but I think it will be also important that with some of the G7 countries we work to align on how we talk to the US, because the fact is that there are some of them, including the one we mentioned, that they have so much security dependence from the US that it will be difficult to actually find, in my view, separate agreements, but rather finding maybe common approaches also to deal with the US.
Mm-hmm. And when you mentioned the talks with regards to China, do you mean aligning more with the US against China, or do you mean working more with China to have more leverage?
So the ambition of the EU for sure is that we have an alignment with the US to have agreements with China together. However, I think this is not very realistic, although it's what we have been saying a lot of times. So what we can do is to align with the US on some aspects of China policy, and we will not align on others. And I think this is in our interest, because it's quite clear that the medium-term goal of the Trump presidency is to find an agreement with China. And so I don't think we need to be instrumental to that, but rather be part of an effort of rebalancing international relations, including on the trade sphere, and clearly the intersection between us, US and China is very important for the tech sovereignty and supply chains that we are talking about today. Yeah.
It's really a lot of soul searching, I think, that's going on, since now we've realized that our best friends is maybe not quite who we thought they were. I really feel that in the room and in discussions that I have. Xavier, you work for an American company and you are European and you do these partnerships with frontier startups. How do you handle that on a day-to-day basis, the new political situation?
So the first thing is I'm not a policy expert.
That helps.
There is enough people, I think, here to maybe answer these kind of questions about American companies. But what I can tell you is on the ground, the way we work. For example, if I take AI, the idea is about choice. And IBM is a more than 100 years old company. So we have seen a lot of things, believe me, not me, but I can feel the culture of IBM regarding this. And our goal is really to empower our clients with technology and provide them the choice. So now that I'm saying that, the reason I'm saying that is when you talk about AI, for example, who said that we need a very big model and to be locked into a public cloud provider? Nobody's. We are promoting open science, and what we say is that we have to give choice. So it means open source models, third-party models. You can create your own model, and you can infuse your own data and own your own models to your business, which makes a lot of difference. And when I say open source, it's real open source. So you can take a model, it's under a certain license that you can then use it as you want. Then you can also use different kind of model for taking into account your language, your culture. So for example, I'm French. I want a model to speak my language, to have my values, and maybe to complain all the time. I'm joking. but you see what I mean? I want my model that speaks like me. And for example, in IBM, what we did is very simple. In some countries, we developed specific models, like in Spain, to incorporate the Spanish language and different regional languages. In France, we partner with Mistral. It's a French startup, it's a very well-known, they have very good models, so we decide to do that. And then we tell our customers you can deploy it where you want, in a public cloud of your choice, on a private cloud, or on your own infrastructure. But the idea is to provide choice in terms of AI models, in terms of deployment, and get them the autonomy. I don't know if it's the right word, but the autonomy to really deploy where they want, what they want.
Just to follow up, does the open source model apply to things like quantum, biotech, like more IP heavy and infrastructure heavy things?
Yeah, so for example, if you take a quantum computer, there is different layers. You have the infrastructure. So for example, the chip is not open source, but then the layers that are up to the chip, for example, the middleware and the framework, we call it Qiskit. It's an open source framework that allows you to develop all the applications. In a kind, also, the open source also allows to incorporate other hardware providers. So that's where also we give choice to the people. So for example, you develop an application, a use case with an open source framework, then you can deploy it where you want. And then the best chip will win the competition or not, but at least you have the choice. And open source plays a very key role, because then you decide where you want to deploy your application.
But how does that affect security, right? Because if we're talking about critical technologies, possibly in critical sectors, does the open source model apply to that? I don't know if any of you hasn't answered that, or yeah, is it dangerous?
Open source technology?
Yeah, on like critical sectors, like say like energy, infrastructure, and so on.
I think you can secure open source. I mean, open source is the way it is that you have a community that is developing, adding features, developing the technology, etc. So, for example, you take hybrid clouds, you need a technology that we call it, sorry, it's a little bit technical, but you containerize application. So you use open source to then deploy the application on the environment you want. And then, of course, you have some companies, like IBM, that has a long history with regulated companies and security that also developed security. But security, you can see it two ways. You have software that can secure the workloads, but open source is also a way to see what is inside AI models, for example. So let's talk about transparency. When you develop a model, make sure that the companies, they just publish the data sources.
Yeah, of course, and then that helps with
First question, exactly. Is it real open source? Do you have the architecture? Do you have everything that is really transparent and you can really rely on and then take it to your company?
There is also another issue about open source, in my view, looking at the regulatory framework we work on and we live in. We have to avoid that the use of the open source label is used, in fact, to circumvent existing norms, to just bring all the responsibility and risks to the final user, because it becomes more difficult to understand who is responsible for what. So I think this is always important, because otherwise it can be a way to actually not take any responsibility for possible risks existing in the system.
I'm going to do a quick pulse check to see if anyone has a 20-second question max. No? Okay, great. I guess, so hearing all of this, I mean, obviously US being top of mind, but is there a difference, like from a policy perspective, between decoupling from the US and decoupling from China?
Yes. Essentially, we don't know what decoupling from China is, and we have absolutely no clue what decoupling from the US is. I think that what's been really striking over the past years is that there's been a lot of talk. So in Europe, we talk more about de-risking from China, but I think that the definition of this concept doesn't really exist. I would say that all policymakers will have a different definition. Some are very hawkish regarding China and will say we need to cut all economic ties. So if you put it at this end of the spectrum, importing toy birds from China is a security risk. We shouldn't rely on China for this. And then at the other end of the spectrum, I think that other policymakers, some countries, are much more relaxed about having economic ties with China, but they want to have a more secure supply of some critical goods for Europe. I think the COVID pandemic was a watershed moment when a lot of Europeans realized that we relied on China for surgical masks, for instance. So you have these two spectrums. Then you can, of course, talk about the sectors. Which sectors do we need to de-risk in? What does that mean for our relations with China? You have another question. If a Chinese company invests in Europe to produce critical goods, is this risking? Is this not de-risking? Key question. So
what do you think on that?
I think it depends on the sector, on the company, on the ties of the company with the Chinese government. It depends if the company wants to make toy birds, we go back to them, or some very critical components in high-tech critical supply chains. I think there is no one-size-fits-all. There is no single answer to any of these questions. So that's what makes it very difficult to de-risk from China, beyond the political considerations. And so on top of this, if you talk about de-risking from the US, well, that's been the concept for the past 3 months, but we also have no idea, also because we have deep economic interdependence with the US. But I think what was really interesting listening to you is also, to me, the other question mark that we have is, what does the US want? And to me, what the US wants, when I take a look at trade policy, currency policy, investment policy, is to provoke a global decoupling from China. And I'm not entirely sure that Europe will accept this. I don't think we will. And I think that a number of countries will also be really reluctant. But I think there is this uncertainty. What's the end game for Trump? And that's what makes it very difficult. The uncertainty is actually very, very high, and that's probably even more damaging for private firms than the policies.
Brando is bursting with comments, I think.
No, but the difficulty in this is that, as we try to explain to our interlocutor, is that if you at the same time want to raise tariffs and threaten to do it even more, you attack us also in the language, the parasites and the exploitation, etc. You ask for more LNG to be bought. You want more weapons to be bought. You want to be aligned on China. It doesn't fit together. There must be putting this into an orderly fashion. But the point is that, as I said, my impression is that on one end you have competing factions on what is the priority among all these things. And also the president has been given a carte blanche by the Congress for at least a little more time. Then probably in a couple months, as there will be the start of campaigning for the midterm elections, because in autumn it's already starting with the primaries, etc. I think the political climate will change, because to be frank, it's a fact that the Congress has relinquished its powers on trade and let the president really do whatever it wants, but it's done on purpose with the idea that now it's the time for letting Trump do its chaos that can bring some results. Let's see if it brings them. If it doesn't happen, then things might actually change also internally. But I think there are also really competing ideas. Those that really want to focus on rebalancing of the trade flows, and those that are really looking at the legislation of the EU and so attacking our legislation. Maybe one thing that is more unifying is exactly the China priority. So to work for as much as possible bringing EU towards an alignment with US on China, and I agree with what was said. It's only possible to some extent. It's not going to be exactly like the same approach that we have seen until now by President Trump before the temporary deal, which is just a ceasefire, we can say, and let's see what will happen next.
Mm-hmm. Do you think Europe is equipped to deal with this chaos?
Europe is ready.
Equipped, like do
equipped.
We have? Because we're also pretty chaotic.
It is because luckily on trade we have given the Commission a federal power. So as a strong advocate for European federalism, I think that luckily on trade, the governments cannot do a total mess. They will try, they are trying so hard to destroy our negotiating position. But luckily, there are instruments in the treaties, I mean, the way we do that will prevent them from screwing it completely. And actually, we will be able to have, I think, a good negotiating position for EU. But Trump was very sincere. He said the EU, in his view, was created to cheat on the US. I don't agree with this approach, but it gives you the idea of what was the thought behind it, that there was the need to fragment the EU position and negotiation. But I think it is not working until now, but I hope the Commission will stay put, as I think it's in the interest of the future of the European Union.
Which EU member state has done the most damage to the trade negotiations?
Well, personally, I think that my own country didn't do a very good job in giving concessions to Trump for some compliments to our Prime Minister. That was the exchange, some good words in exchange of more LNG, more contracts for weapons, etc. Why I don't think it's a good idea? Because in this logic, this is put on a side and it doesn't count in the negotiation. It's just giving for free. I think it's not contributing to the actual final deal. While these things, including LNG, including security, must be part of the broader deal.
All right, thank you so much for joining us. I'm afraid that this is all we have time for. We started with some pretty specific technologies, but then we ended up talking about the very grand soul searching that Europe is going through. We talked about how a unified approach is very important. We also talked about the importance of the China factor. So we definitely have a lot more to think about, and let's hope that by next year, things will be more settled on the other side of the Atlantic as well. There's going to be a networking break until noon, and we will then have a branded segment with MasterCard's Senior Vice President of the Public Sector in Europe, and then an editorial session on European cloud sovereignty specifically, moderated by my colleague Mathieu Paulet. Feel free to come meet us in the networking space. Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much. Thank you.